So, good afternoon. I am April Lavadia, and I will be leading today's interview. I am a student at Prince George's Community College, and I want to thank you for setting aside a time in this fine weekend to meet with us today. This conversation is to learn more about your leadership experience, so feel free to relax and be yourself. And let's go ahead and get this started. So, for the first question that I have is, what is your title and describe a typical day in your position? Basically, how much do you spend time on your working on your typical day, basically?
So right now,
Yeah, yes.
okay, so I have two titles. One is that I am a adjunct professor of communications and public relations at Prince George's Community College and at the University of Maryland Global Campus. And the second title is I'm the editor of Kane's Beverage News Daily, which is a newsletter that covers the regulation and financing of the alcoholic beverage industry.
I see. Okay, sounds great. And number two, what does leadership mean to you?
Well, leadership is leadership has several different dimensions. So let me take it out of what I'm doing right now and take it into a different universe. Because right now, aside from leading classes, I don't have a leadership role. I'm not a chairman of a department or a dean of a school or president of a college or any of those exciting. And in today's world, especially with President Trump, high pressure jobs, right?
For sure.
So right now, it's good to be low level.
Yeah.
So leadership really is about having a vision and getting people to follow your vision and to uh, implement your vision. And that's different than management because management is about getting things done. So the leader's job is to lead, but the manager's job is to get things done. And those are really two different functions. Um, the uh, and that's not to say that they can't be done at all levels. Uh, in the case of Prince George's Community College, for instance, our president really establishes a vision for the college. Um, she presents it to the board of trustees, she presents to the faculty senate, other groups within the governance structure of the college, but basically she works it out. She gets buy-in from all these other people, gets the board of trustees to basically bless it and say, yes, this is the official vision for the college for the next 5 or 10 years. And then she goes out and her next job is to get everybody else to get in line and follow it along. So having done that, the next level down for academics is the provost, the executive vice president provost, the number two person in the college. And his job is to her vision and translate that into a vision for what the academic side of the college is going to do. So he then has the task of creating his own vision based upon her vision for the college. And coming on down, the deans of our divisions have that same task. They take his vision and her vision and translate into a vision for the different divisions. So in the case of where I am, which is the humanities and social sciences division, um, our dean's job is to translate their vision into specific goals and objectives for us, and then to get us moving forward in that direction. A
Right.
manager's job is different. A manager's job is having been told what the goals and objectives are, is simply to accomplish them. Period. End of discussion.
Oh, that's a great answer. So for the next question that I have is, what strengths do you have as a leader, and what are weaknesses that you may have?
What strengths do I have? Um, Age, first of all, and I think that's a real critical one. It's otherwise known as experience. And that really is important. Um, you can get that in two ways. You get it simply by being around and having a lot of experience, or you can get it through education. And my favorite example going back in history is World War II. So in World War II, the U.S. did a really good job. We won the war. I mean, there's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. We won. We defeated Nazi Germany. We defeated um, Japan, and along the way, we sort of wiped Italy off the face of the map. They had a second-rate little tyrant who sort of followed in the footsteps of Hitler like a dog, and whatever Hitler wanted him to do, he went and did it. Um, so they Franklin Roosevelt, who was the president at the time, of course, had to establish the overall vision for the country and all of that, and he did that fairly successfully. He had to say, we're going to fight this war and we're going to do what we have to do, blah blah blah. And but for the actual combat operations, he appointed two commanders. One was General Eisenhower in Europe, the other was uh, General MacArthur in Asia. And in the case of General Eisenhower, his orders were very specific. And that is, you will invade the continent of Europe and conquer and subdue the German Nazi apparatus.
Right.
Just boom, put them underground, so to speak. Uh, After that, Roosevelt left it up to Eisenhower. So Eisenhower's job then was to envision the whole thing and move that forward, which he did obviously successfully. But people wanted him to attack Germany like within 9 months after we got involved. And he refused to do that for 2.5 or 3 years because he knew that we had to build up our forces and all that sort of stuff because his philosophy, and it's the correct philosophy, was that if you're going to fight a war, you want to have an overwhelming amount of strength before you get involved in combat. So he wanted his motto was he wanted a battalion to fight a platoon.
Mm-hmm.
So they just had no hope. They were just going to be crushed. And that was sort of the vision. And then he, of course, had people who plotted, we're going to take this first and that next and so on. But that was the thing. And he went traveling around and he uh, visited the troops and got in line in the mess hall units or feeding lines or whatever. So he knew what their morale was. A key part of leadership is wandering around. Um, some people think you can do this by sitting behind a desk and being the grand poobah, but actually you really have to get out and wander around. Lord Mountbatten of Burma, who was actually a cousin of Queen Elizabeth, uh, at one point said leadership requires a bit of a show. And Queen Elizabeth said, you have to be seen to be believed. So what Eisenhower did was he got out and he went wandering around and saw the troops and all that sort of thing. And he had other people who took care of a lot of the details that he was responsible for, but he knew them, he trusted them, and knew that they would do what he wanted to have done. And he was out there dealing with the troops, dealing with the politics, and that sort of thing. And as I said, establishing the vision that Martin Luther King did exactly the same thing. Martin Luther King led the civil rights movement in the United States during his time,
Mm-hmm.
but he had other people, Ralph Abernathy being one, and others who did a lot of the work. So that vision thing is the key function for a leader.
Mm-hmm.
That's a long answer. By the way, you don't have to come to my class when I teach leadership. You can stay home because you're getting it all now.
All right. And what would you say you would consider as your weaknesses as a leader?
Um,
I know you said age is your main strength due to.
well, experience really, because with age comes experience, and so in my case, um, I was editor of my high school paper. My professional background is essentially journalism and communications. So I was editor of my high school paper, so I had to manage that and the people who were involved in that. I was editor of my college paper, and that involved real editorship. The high school paper was not real editorship. I was an editorial writer for the St. Petersburg Times, so I was involved in that policy level of what does the paper think. um, at, I then worked for a couple of other papers. I was a business editor for the Philadelphia Bulletin. So again, at that point, I had to lead a department, and that was both a leadership and a managerial role because I had to establish a vision for what we were going to do with that department. that was in line with the publisher's vision, but I also had to manage it. So I had to make sure we met our deadlines and, you know, that the paper got out on time and we did not hold it up. And then I got my own little publishing company. And, at that point, I was actually running the show. I had people that worked for me. At one point, I had 9 people who were producing 15 publications and all of that. So that was the positive thing. So I have that strength of experience.
Mm-hmm.
My weakness is I really don't like to fire people.
Okay.
Um, I really don't. Donald Trump used to like to go on TV and say, "You're fired," and I don't like to do that. And at one point, I had somebody that I really had to fire, and I knew it. Everybody else knew it, but I didn't do it for a while. And after I finally got around to letting this guy go, one of my excuse me, one of my other one of my reporters walked into my office and she said, "Well, it's about time." And I said, "Well, what do you mean?" She said, "Look, you fired him in your mind about 4 months ago, and we all knew it." And I said, "Well, you're right about the 4 months, but how did you know it?" She said, "You would come into the office and you would look right through him. He wasn't there in your mind. And
Mm-hmm.
you should have just let him go then because he was just taking your money at that point and getting nothing done." And she was right. So, I mean, that's a weakness, and it's a serious weakness because at that point he's causing morale problems and other things. So, that's a weakness.
Having a hard time of letting go of people despite, it affecting you or your program.
Yeah, and the other weakness I have is that once I get a serious idea in my head, I have trouble accepting other people's
I see. So,
letting them argue with me. I
okay.
really like to get my way.
Mhm.
I told somebody today that, I'm a retired Army officer, I'm a retired lawyer, I'm a journalist, I'm a professor. I'm used to getting my way,
Yeah.
and that can be an issue.
Mm-hmm. And the fourth question is that leaders make other people feel strong and confident. So, what do you do to help others feel this way?
A couple of things. One is it's a coaching factor. So, in a large organization that I've been a leader in, meaning if I was the CEO, say, of the Philadelphia Bulletin, which at the time I was there, we had a news department of about 300 people,
Mhm.
and a total business operation altogether. The paper probably employed about 900 people. If I was the publisher, one of my things that I would have done would have been I would just walked around every day through every department and found out what was going around. One of my newspaper heroes is a guy named Barney Kilgore who took the Wall Street Journal when it was a 33,000 circulation financial trade paper and turned it into the nation's first national newspaper. We had printing plants in 8 different locations, and by the time he died, we had a circulation of almost 1 million subscribers and 1.2 million readers. And 98% of our readers got their paper on the day that it said on the front page. And and but he had a routine every morning. He was picked up by his driver at a certain level. You have a driver who comes in his limousine and picks you up. And Barney's limousine, which wasn't actually a long stretch limousine, it was a nice car, but it was not super fancy. But his license plate was WSJ1, and his number two guy had a car with WSJ2 on it. The third guy had WSJ3. But his driver came to his house in Princeton, New Jersey, picked him up. Barney sat in the back seat and took the paper that was there for him and read it, and went through with a red pen and marked it up. And then went into the office when they got to New York, went upstairs, signed the letters that his secretary had ready for him to sign, a lot of which were just, thank you for writing, blah, 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 and that sort of thing. But he signed them. And then at 10:15, he went into a room next to his office, which was just sort of a conference area, but not a formal conference room, and sat down with his top team. And they had what they called the coffee clash. And they talked about, uh, how the Yankees did versus the Mets and,
Mhm.
all this other sort of stuff. And they also talked about the paper.
Mhm.
And so they sort of exchanged ideas there. And when that was done, Barney left that meeting, and every single day when he was in New York, he then proceeded to walk the 8 floors that Dow Jones had in his building and went down through every department, including all the way down to the sub basement where they had the big rolls of newsprint, and the newsprint handlers were getting ready, setting it up on the presses for the next morning's paper, and talked to people down there, talked to the foreman, talked to the routine workers, did that in the accounting department, everywhere else. So he knew what was going on, and
Hmm.
that's part of the key. You have to be in touch with your operation. You cannot sit and wait for reports to come in. You have to be out there. And when he went out on the road, he did exactly the same thing. If he went to Chicago,
Hmm.
he went through the entire operation out there, started in the news department, went through the production and advertising, the whole thing. So he was constantly taking in information about how things were going. And it's the essential thing. Eisenhower did exactly that same thing when he was out in the field visiting troops, you
Hmm.
know.
I see. So we have about 14 minutes left because I have the 40-minute free trial for Zoom. But my next question is, do you feel it's important to delegate? If so, why? And when is a good time to delegate?
Delegation, yeah, you have to delegate if you're running any sort of a large organization. You really do. And large organization starts with about 5 to 10 people because you can't do everything. Uh, you might want to, and it might be true that only you can do it as well as you can do it. But you know what? There's only 24 hours a day, and you have to eat, and you have to sleep, and you have to use the bathroom.
Hmm.
So, you know, you have to delegate. And that implies that you also have to train people. You have to make sure they understand where you want to go. And then you have to give them freedom to get there themselves.
Hmm.
Uh, because um, you can't constrict them too tightly.
Right.
Um, you can't put them in a rigid little box and say you have to follow procedure number 3, step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4. You have to give them that ability to act. Otherwise, on anything that's different, they'll have to come to you, and you'll be overwhelmed. So you want to build your organization in such a way that your people can make decisions on their own that are reflective of where you want to go.
Hmm.
So
Or
in
into.
the in the case of Prince George's Community College, for instance, our president wants the college to be known as one of the best community colleges in the country.
Hmm.
In fact, she wants us to be known as the best community college in the country. So, for her team, with that understanding, they can then start to make decisions about how they want to run their operations to achieve that goal within their operation. And to be the best community college in the country, we have to have the best facilities. They have to be the best maintained facilities because we can't have brand new facilities every year.
Hmm.
But just that would not work. But we certainly can have clean facilities. Certainly can have well maintained facilities. Um, we have to have the right the right way we handle our students when they apply. We need to make that as painless as possible, and so on all the way through. So, once you understand where we want to go, everybody else can then do their part. But if people don't understand where we want to go, they can't do their part, or they'll do their thing. Well, the boss wants to do that thing.
Hmm. I have four more questions left. So the next question that I have is, what three or four actions do you believe are essential to enable others to be successful?
What are the 4 actions I believe are essential for others to be successful?
Correct.
Um, First, you have to well, first of all, you have to establish what you mean by success. So, because there are different definitions of success, but uh, let's assume, first of all, you're talking about success in the job. So obviously you have to establish what that translates to.
Mm-hmm.
And if it's a sales job, you have to then um, establish what sort of sales targets you expect people to meet.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and if you're talking about a manager of salespeople, you then have to establish how he's going to do that. So you have to think that out. And so establishing the objective for other people is an important factor. The second important factor is to basically engage in a coaching activity because people make mistakes and people aren't always online with your vision, not because they don't want to be, but because they don't understand it, or they get led off to another vision and they need to be brought back into line. The third thing is you need to establish, in my opinion, um, you need to establish pretty clear expectations as to how the organization should run.
Mm-hmm.
And then, having done that, you manage by exception. So, as an example, at the St. Petersburg Times, they had a wild overtime form. Uh, by federal law, if somebody works more than 40 hours a week, they're entitled to be paid time and a half. Okay. Uh, and that's an accounting function. You know, you work 41 hours, you get a time and a half for 1 hour. But that doesn't tell you anything about management. That just is an accounting function. So what the St. Pete Times did was they wanted to tighten things up because they wanted to be the best newspaper in Florida and one of the best newspapers in the country. So what they did was they created this little form that was on salmon pink paper, and it was cut in such a way that it stuck out on the boss's stack of papers on his desk like this.
Mm-hmm.
And it had three questions on it. Why was this overtime necessary? What was accomplished during this overtime? And how can this be prevented in the future?
Mm-hmm.
Now, that sounds like we don't want to pay you,
Right.
but we're perfectly happy to pay you. So
Mm-hmm.
said the production manager,
Mm-hmm.
whose department was the one that ran up the overtime most of the time.
I see.
And the answer to the questions was, well, as a smart ass young reporter, my answers were, you know, why was this overtime necessary? The mayor died at 9 p.m. at night or at 11 p.m. at night. How can we avoid this? Make the mayor die only during business hours, and that sort of thing. But the production manager told us that the real idea was that in the newspaper business, when you had printing presses
Mm-hmm.
in particular, some papers still do, um, the paper that runs through those presses is running at a really high rate of speed and it's got a lot of tension on the paper. It's pulling it real hard
Mm-hmm.
and it'll break. It's going to break. It has to break. The question is, how often does it break? It should break for the times 3 times a day.
Mm-hmm.
If it breaks 4 times a day, there's a problem. And that fourth time is probably going to cause overtime because it's going to require more time than they had planned to
Mm-hmm.
fix it.
I see.
And so the answer to those questions were, you know, in the press department, why was this overtime necessary? Web break on press unit number 15. What was accomplished during this overtime? We gerrymandered a fix for something or other on that press unit. How can this be prevented in the future? We need part number such and such or a different type of part so we can repair this. The next morning, when the production manager came in, here was the overtime report sticking out on his desk, and he could look at that and tell his secretary to have that part air freighted in so it
Mm-hmm.
was there that evening or certainly by the next day, and they could fix it and stop the web from breaking on a repeated basis. And that's how the St. Petersburg Times became the most profitable newspaper in the country as a percent of sales
Mm-hmm.
because they paid attention to those little details by managing by exception.
I see. So you think that objective is the number one action, number two is engaging in a coaching activity, and you said what was the third?
That managing by exception idea, if you establish what your expectation is for every job that you can think of in the operation. And you don't do this automatically, it develops over time,
Hmm.
right? Um, but you figure out what your expectations are for each of these jobs, and then you manage, you let people do their thing, except when their thing doesn't work, and then you come in and you fix it.
Right. I see.
You
Or
know, it's just like you as a student, you do your thing, you write your paper, you know, we read it, we say this is good, except you misspelled this word, you
Mhm.
know.
I see.
Does
Um,
that make sense?
yeah.
Yeah.
It, so I have about 5 minutes left for the interview, but I still have, I think, sorry, I think I have four more questions left. What we can do, we could maybe cut it into another Zoom meeting if you'd like, if you need more time, or we could, I guess.
Well, you got Gabby guts here, so sorry.
No, no, you're okay. So, what advice do you have for building relationship and trust in an organization?
Say that one more time.
What advice do you have for building relationships and trust in an organization?
Or or what again?
Sorry, what advice do you have for building relationship
For building relationships within
and
an
trust?
organization?
Yes, and trust.
Okay. Um, Number one, be nice.
Mm-hmm.
Number two, um, take an interest in other people.
Mm-hmm.
Number three, have good objectives for what the team is trying to do because the organization is a team sport. It's not individual stars. Basketball teams do not win by having individual stars, even where there is an individual star of the basketball team. That star is supported by all the other people who do their thing, so he can be the star. Likewise, football teams,
Mm-hmm.
you know, most of life is a team sport.
Mm-hmm.
So those are I would say the three main things, and that translates also to coaching. You got to do a lot of coaching, you to help people come along because once you're in a leadership position, you have experience that other people don't have, and part of your job is to impart your wisdom.
Mm-hmm.
And the other thing is you have to be perfectly willing to say, you know, I'm going to train this person. This person is probably going to
Mm-hmm.
rise above me because this person actually is better than I am.
Right.
And you have to be willing to say, I'm going to let this person go to the maximum of their ability.
I see.
And by the way, not every person is willing to do that.
Right. Everybody is an individual person. Moving on to our next question is that your reporting has influenced federal policy decisions such as the story on alcohol and tobacco tax and Trade Bureau TTB. How do you see leadership manifesting in the power of the press?
How did my leadership involve that?
Yeah, how does your leadership, I guess, involve in the press? How does it manifest in press? How do you think leadership can
Well,
look?
that was actually an indirect leadership situation. The story behind that is I was at one of these infamous alcohol beverage receptions, doing what I usually do, which was leaning against the wall because it was entirely too crowded to do any interviews or anything like that. And a guy comes up next to me and he says, uh, Joel, I got something I think you might be interested in. Give me a call in the next couple of days and let's do lunch. So I called him and he said, I think you're going to really be interested in this. Let's do lunch. I said, sure, when? He said, how about tomorrow at such and such a place, which was away from where he was normally going to do things. So we go to lunch and we have a nice little chat for a few minutes. And he reaches in his pocket and pulls out a piece of paper and passes it across to me. And he says, you don't know where you got this,
Mhm.
but I assure you it's accurate. I said, okay. And I put it in my pocket. We went on, talked a little bit. And I got back to my office and I took a look at it and I said, oh my goodness, because it was a document from the Office of Management and Budget basically planning to put the agency that regulates the alcohol beverage business out of business. They were going to put the tax collection function with the IRS, which nobody wants to have their business involved with. And the other function was going to go to, I think, the FDA or the Federal Trade Commission, one of those. And, it just seems sort of crazy. And So I made a couple of phone calls, verified it. I verified it not because anybody admitted it, but because people said we can't talk to you about that. And I said that's good enough for me. And so I took the thing and basically printed the whole document and started calling other people and saying, what will this do? And in terms of a leadership thing, that was really a typical journalism leadership operation because the results was that other people were able to take that and go up to Capitol Hill and go to Congress and say, you cannot do this. You know, this will cause a lot of trouble. Here's what the results will this be. And this will be bad for the industry and bad for government because the agency they wanted to put out of business was actually was perhaps the most efficient tax collecting agency in the US government. Um, and, you know, you don't want to do that. And because of that, they stopped that attempt to put that agency out of business. Uh, the other side of that story was that it also caused a lot of trouble, apparently, because I got a phone call a couple of days later from the PR person for that agency, and he said, we can't talk to you anymore. And they still haven't talked to me. Um, and I learned later that this agency was part of the Treasury Department. It was a very small bureau within this huge Department of the Treasury. And the Treasury Department sent their agents out. In the federal government, term agent means criminal investigators
Mhm.
with badges and credentials and the power to arrest people, and started interviewing people within the agency trying to figure out who gave me the document.
Mhm.
Nobody in the agency gave me the document, so they could all say I didn't do it. But
Mhm.
somebody gave it to my source who gave it to me. So
Connections and default.
that's how that happened.
I see.
And I was very happy to be responsible for stopping that. By the way, just as a side item, let me brag for 30 seconds. Um, I talked to a couple of reporters who had covered the budget process for like the last 20 years, and they were insanely jealous. That document was technically called a pushback,
Mhm.
and they said to me, "We've never been able to get our hands on a pushback. How did you do that?" And I said, "Well, I told exactly what I told you."
Mhm. Oh, that's amazing.
Yeah,
Treasury Department.
you know. But I've been talking to people, you know, on my beat for several years, and
Mhm.
one day somebody said, "This is something I think you'll be interested in." So
Okay. Good connections and stuff. Okay, so number nine, what was your what was the most unforgettable story that you've covered in your journaling career, and how did you and your colleagues navigate the situation as a teamwork or
the
collaboration?
most unforgettable story.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I'm going to be a weasel here. I'm going to say there are three. One was the one I just told you, which was a big policy story. The other was, and this is where I once again proved to you that I'm really old, was the assassination of President Kennedy. I was in college at the time, and I was interviewing, I was on my college paper, it was my junior year. I was interviewing the dean of students at Indiana University. And I was sitting in his office, and we were having a nice little chat like we are right now. And his secretary walks in and says, I'm sorry to bother you, Bob, but his name was Bob Schaefer. I'm sorry to bother you, Bob. I think you would like to know that President Kennedy's been shot. And I looked at him and I said, I think I have to go. And she sticks her head back in a couple of minutes later before I'd gotten out of there and says, they say he's dead. And I said, now I really have to go. So I walked back through campus and just paid attention to the atmosphere and came back and wrote a story. It was the only staff written story on the in the Indiana Daily Student for that day, and it was on the front page with a byline. So that was the second one. The third one was when I was a intern at the Indianapolis Star, which was the morning paper in my hometown, and there was an explosion at the Indiana State Fairgrounds Coliseum,
Mm-hmm.
and they were having an ice skating show, and one of the
Performers?
places where they sell, you know, food underneath the
Oh.
stands, you know, concession stands, concession booths.
Oh.
There gas containers blew up for some reason or other, and it was a horrible thing. I mean, dozens of people were killed, and I went out there, did my thing. I walked across the ice. There were body parts, bits of flesh, and all that, and I wrote a story about that. So those were the three that really stick in my mind.
Mhm.
They were all individual stories. The nature of journalism typically is that it's going to be a individual effort. But those are the three that stick in my mind.
I see. So for the last question that I have, basically connects to the last question before, but based on your curriculum vitae that I see in Canvas, I see that you've been in the field since basically 1964 when you know get off college, when you started college for your journaling career. How do you lead with integrity when reporting to sensitive or controversial topics? I know you've spoken about, you know, Kennedy being shot and an explosion and the gas, but how do you maybe in different types of stories that you have, how do you lead with integrity if, you know, not everybody leads with
So the answer to that is good. Also, the one thing you didn't ask me about is my time as a public official.
oh,
So we'll talk about that also,
sure.
okay? And the answer to both of those questions is essentially you just go out and try to do an honest job without worrying too much about the consequences of it.
Right.
So in the case of those three things I told you about, um, the explosion at the Indiana State Fairgrounds, that's simple. You just go out and you just simply describe what you see. It's not rocket science. It's a horrible scene. You try to describe it in words as best you can. If you're doing TV, you decide whether or not you want to do a camera shoot and show the body parts, and you probably don't, but you might do it and let the production people say, no, we're not going to show that.
Right.
Um, in the case of Kennedy, um, that was interesting because apparently I have no soul or something because everybody else was in shock and we're standing when I got back to the office, they were standing around the teletype machine in tears and cold-hearted me was just got over, looked at the teletype machine, said, get out of my way, and went
Mhm.
over to my typewriter and wrote a story. And in the case of the pushback,
Mhm.
um, again, it's just, you know, the job of a reporter is to write down what other people say. It's not to be brilliant and offer your opinion. It's just to write down what other people say. So that's what I did. That's essentially how I've lived my journalistic life. Now, what you did not ask about was my time as a elected public official because
Mhm.
that's where life can get interesting.
Right.
So, um, 2 points on that, or three. One is that I was elected to my town council. I'd served on the planning board for a number of years, and I'd also served on a county commission. So I was not an amateur. I got elected to my town council, and the one of the things that we ha we had we had the same pressure that every other elective legislative body has, and whether it's a town council or a state legislature or Congress of the United States, it's all the same case. The job is to set the budget and to oversee the executive branch's operation of the town. It's essentially the board of directors. And we had one guy who was super liberal and who wanted to, the sky was the limit on what we would do, and whatever it cost it was what it cost. And then we had another guy who was out to cut, who was sort of like Elon Musk, who was all set to cut the property tax rate by 20%, which would have basically shut down the town. And everybody else was sort of in the middle. And as it turned out, I'd been out campaigning on my first time, and I had knocked on a door, and somebody answered, and he said, "Well, what are you going to do for me?" And I said, "I never thought about that question." So I took a deep breath and said, "Well, I'm going to cut your taxes." Good Republican answer, right? And he said, "No, you're not." I said, "Huh?" And he said, "I know this town." He said, "These people are really efficient. They work hard, they do their job, and they're really tight with the money." And he said, "Frankly, I think that our local officials deserve the same cost of living increase that I get every year. So you're not going to cut my taxes. Now, what are you going to do for me?"
Mhm.
And, and I said, "Well, okay, in that case, I'll try to hold your tax increase to the cost of living." He
Mhm.
said, now you're talking. He said, I'll vote for you on that basis, but not if you're going to cut my taxes because I don't think you can do it.
Mhm.
And I went in and basically took that position and convinced everybody else on the council that that was, in fact, the objective we should have going as we started the process. We set that as the objective for developing the budget, and then we could go out and
Mhm.
talk to the department heads, and say, can you help us out here? What can you do there? And so on. And we were able to every year that I was on council, we were able to hold our tax increases basically to the cost of living.
I see.
And that's why for 5 of my 6 years, I was council president. Also, I got a very subtle attempt at a pitch for a bribe. Um, I got at one point there was a bank that was new to town, and they came by and talked to me and explained to me how they could, as a successful business owner, they could offer me a interest rate on a business loan that was about a point and a half below the normal rate. And, that was a bribe. That
Mhm.
was flat out a bribe. It was couched in such a way that everybody could deny it, but I knew it was a bribe. They knew it was a bribe, and they would expect something in return for that.
I see. Okay. So a
And
bribe.
the answer to that question is no, you just don't accept those things. You're very polite in your rejection, but you say, you know, I appreciate the thought, but at the moment I don't have any immediate financing needs, so, you know, thanks, but no thanks.
Mhm. I see. So just don't follow it if it goes against your morals as
Yeah.
a leader. Okay. All right. So that was 10 questions to ask for Professor Whitaker, as I know you asked. And thank you for joining me in this fine weekend on a Saturday and being able to set aside a time. But yeah, that concludes our leadership interview. Okay.
It's my pleasure. Glad to be with you.
Uh-huh.